Falcon's Hollow, Pennsylvania was a quiet community where the daughter of a blind soldier was ready to deliver a lesson to the state's most infamous motorcycle gang. A former Special Forces operator was unknowingly targeted when the Shadow Riders, headed by Axel Demon Steele, chose to harass Sarah Mitchell and her father at a nearby diner. Sarah would enlist the help of 40 elite veterans, men and women whose lives she had spared in some of the world's most dangerous battle zones, with just one phone call. "Come on, we need a break. Give us the location from where you're watching." If you're interested in this type of stuff, make sure to subscribe because tomorrow we have a really special story in store for you. As the first rays of morning light danced Steele Betty's home-cooked meals, the scent of freshly brewed coffee and bacon cooked to perfection wafted through the crisp autumn air. Her father James was blind, and Sarah Mitchell helped him through the diner's entryway with the exacting precision that came from her years of military service. Despite his spectacles, James Mitchell maintained the stately posture and honor befitting a seasoned Marine who had served his nation honorably before an IED blinded him. With the same unassuming power that had won him the Navy SEAL in a war that was mostly forgotten, his worn hands firmly grasped his white cane. From behind the counter, Betty greeted you too with a voice that carried decades of community service. "I am almost done brewing the fresh coffee." With the same level of precision as a military operation, Sarah placed her father's cutlery precisely where he had instructed. "Your coffee is ready, Dad, at 3 o'clock. At 1, there will be toast. That wheat bread you love is available now at Betty's." James casually traced his breakfast scenery with his fingertips as they brushed against the table's surface. "My darling, this isn't something you need to do each morning. You are more needed by the shelter than I am." In response, Sarah said, "The shelter can wait," while her eyes darted involuntarily toward the entrance of the restaurant. Decades of practice crumbled. Now is our chance. With the coffee pot in hand, Betty came over with their customary request. The morning crowd was beginning to assemble. Among them are Mike, the mailman, an old woman from the flower store named Mrs. Henderson, and 2 construction workers from the new development project. They were engrossed in the usual cadence of village life. The faraway sound of motorbikes broke the tranquil landscape. Sarah's body language changed subtly as her awareness of the approaching noise intensified. She watched the coming bikes through the wide front windows, counting 5, 10, and finally 15. As the night riders pulled into the parking lot, the glimmer of the dawn sun reflected off the chrome and leather. James clenched his fist a little harder on his cane. "Lots of noise in that area." "Oh, Dad, only a few motorcycles." Sarah spoke calmly, but her thoughts were racing with calculations of possible weapons, escape routes, and angles. Everything could be transformed into a tool if necessary, including the heavy ceramic coffee pot that Betty still held, the sturdy oak napkin holders, and the fire extinguisher by the kitchen. It was none other than Axel Demon Steele who stepped onto the track first. The scars and cuts on his leather body were symbols of aggression and fear. Blade, his enforcer, Hawk, their weapons expert, Spectre, their scout, and Blade, their demolitions expert, followed after him in his inner circle. The aroma of leather and exhaust permeated the restaurant as the remaining members of the gang trailed behind them. As Betty placed the coffee pot on the table, her hands quivered a little. In an effort to blend in, the other customers withdrew a little. It seemed like nothing had changed for anyone except Sarah and James, who carried on with their breakfast as usual. Well, Axel said, his voice echoing through the restaurant. "So, what exactly is this?" Unbeknownst to me, they release blind men without providing them with a signal dog. Sarah made a seemingly comforting gesture by reaching out to hold her father's hand, but it was really an attempt at restraint. Prior to his vision loss, James served as a Marine. Those instincts were still there. In a fair manner, Sarah announced that the breakfast special was on the board. Make a purchase or proceed. On his way to their booth, Axel's boots scuffed against the floor. Without realizing it, his crew took strategic positions all throughout the café. Sarah mentally mapped out possible outcomes by taking careful note of every spot and line of sight. Quite courageous remarks from a young girl pretending to be a nurse to a cripple. Crawling over their table, Axel scowled. James's voice, composed and polite, eased the strain. "You don't scare my daughter, my son. And I've encountered more formidable foes than a man who finds strength in a gang." Like smoke, the words lingered in the atmosphere. As soon as Axel recognized the slur, his expression turned gloomy. Blade and Hawk drew nearer from behind him, their fingers dipping toward hidden guns. "Old man, you are completely unprepared for this situation." Axel lowered his voice to an alarming whisper. "No." Sarah lifted her head and met his intense stare. "Who are you dealing with? You don't know. One final opportunity. Get something to eat or go." It was an unpleasant, harsh chuckle from Axel. "Alternatively, what? Do you intend to contact law enforcement? Rarely do you see one of them. Now this is where Shadow Rider calls home." Sarah's pocket phone was lightly touched by her fingers. It would only take one phone call. It was a one-way street once she got there. A complete shift would occur. "What is the territory?" James's voice exuded an air of unwavering authority. "What little land you have is limited to what good people give you in exchange for their fear, son. And a few of us have overcome our fears." With a furious expression on his face, Axel straightened up. "Perhaps we could set an example of respect for this town by treating you two with the utmost dignity." The diner's tension was at an all-time high. A number of other patrons stood by in horrified quiet as the altercation escalated. With the phone poised in her palm, Betty remained motionless behind the counter, fearful of summoning assistance. Numerous possibilities flooded Sarah's thoughts. Before the others could get to her, she may defeat Axel and likely hit her. You may use the coffee pot as a weapon. The booth offered some protection. However, her father could be at risk, and innocent bystanders could be casualties of the gunfire. Still another option would be for her to take the lead. A single appeal to those who knew the meaning of true commitment and strength. People who had never forgotten the debt they owed her for their lives. The decision seemed clear as Axel extended his hand for James's slender spectacles. "Come with me as I show you the image of a blind hero." The sound of Sarah's voice sliced through the restaurant. "Your life will be consumed by regret if you dare to touch him." Her tone caused Axel to pause. There was an unfathomable level of violence in her eyes that the jaded gang boss had a fleeting glimpse of. Now that the sun had risen higher in the sky, it was shining through the windows of the diner, creating long shadows that stretched astill the landscape. A choice that might alter Eagle's Hollow irrevocably was being deliberated in those shadows. Disappearance was no longer an option. It was time to get to one's feet. Sarah Mitchell was prepared to make the life-altering call when she reached for her phone. The shadows were about to find out that a vulnerable blind guy and his daughter hadn't been targeted. The price they would pay for inviting someone who knew the real cost of war to their side would be more than they could have ever imagined. Muscle memory guided Sarah's fingers as they deftly traced the number she prayed she would never need. It was obvious that Axel thought she was phoning the police as he observed with a cold, calculating smile. Leaning in closer, he smirked and said, "Go ahead." His leather cut made a creaking sound. "Contact whomever you desire. We will have finished teaching you respect by the time they arrive." The diner's windows revealed an even larger gathering of shadow riders in the parking lot, their bikes creating a dazzling wall of chrome and steel. With the intention of intimidating, Sarah tallied 25 in total. However, it provided her with the precise number of risks she would have to address. Sarah, speaking into the phone with Colonel Morrison, exuded the same composed authority that had previously led Special Forces teams into dangerous battle zones. "Do you still have the favor from Kandahar that you owe me?" The moment she brought up Kandahar, a change occurred in the atmosphere. James, realizing the gravity of the situation, slightly straightened his back. Some of the more senior shadow riders, who had been there before everything went wrong, exchanged wary looks. As Sarah went on, she mentioned that she was at Betty's house in Eagles Hollow, where she was meeting up with old friends and making new ones, some of whom would use a respect lesson. A short pause followed by the words, 10 minutes, Captain, don't start without us, said by a rough voice. A look of bewilderment turned into wrath on Axel's face. Excuse me, Captain, but what game are you in? Not interested, Sarah said, putting her phone down. Allowing you the opportunity to depart before things become more intricate. Stryker advanced toward their booth, his enormous stature obstructing their view. Something doesn't seem right, boss. Kandahar, she said, slipping her tongue. Quiet down. Axel became angry, but his voice betrayed a hint of doubt. Do you honestly believe that the rent-a-cops you just contacted have the power to frighten me? James had decades of fighting experience in his low laugh. You would have been running by now, son, if you had known who was coming. After escorting other clients out the rear door, Betty went to the kitchen. Everyone had left the restaurant save for Sarah, James, and the shadow riders. Dawn light poured in through the windows, casting sharp shadows that pulsed with mounting suspense. Sarah checked her watch and calmly told me that you had 8 minutes. When that happens, things start to heat up. Hawk, who specialized in firearms for the gang, stepped over to the window. Somewhat paled his face. The North Road is making progress, boss. Many motorcycles arriving quickly. Who cares? Despite his growling, Axel's eyes revealed his increasing anxiety. This area belongs to us. The data is at our fingertips. With an almost conversational tone, Sarah made the observation that numbers don't matter much when compared to experience. People who have endured more than just leather-jacketed bullies are going to meet you. Aside from the Shadow Rider's cacophonous roar, a distant rumble of motorbikes became increasingly audible. The cacophony you heard was the precise marching of trained horses in perfect harmony. The gang's scout, Spectre, stormed the diner. The roads are being blocked by them. Bikes are positioned on every roadway that leads out. Attention to detail, Commander. Not your average motorcyclists. Axel reached into his jacket, where Sarah could see the protrusion of a hidden weapon. Her body stiffened up, poised to act, but she was restrained by James's firm grip on her arm. No, not just yet. This was Sarah's final opportunity. Now is the time to leave while you have the chance, or you can stay and encounter true fighters. The first bike's arrival could be seen via the windows. The cyclists didn't display any territorial patches or colors. The only subtle insignia on their leather jackets were those that every veteran would recognize. Medals and insignia from elite combat teams, the Marine Corps, and Special Forces. Think we're scared of your military friends? Axel's voice revealed his narcissism as it quivered slightly. We ride off in a chariot. We call this town home. No. As the door to the eatery swung open, a different voice entered the discourse. This town is truly owned by its inhabitants. Those whom we pledge to safeguard. Standing in the doorway, Colonel Jack Morrison exuded the calm authority befitting a man who had guided soldiers through unimaginable adversity and returned them safely to safety. Additional veterans advanced after him, their steps synchronized with the accuracy that comes from years of training. While Axel came to terms with how drastically he had erred, Sarah sat quietly and watched his expression. It wasn't like these cops could be bought or bullied. These were fighters with experience in the darkest corners of the earth, who had a degree of understanding for brutality that common criminals lacked. Now, let's talk about respect, Sarah subtly added. Honest deference. Those you work for, not those you coerce into giving up. Subscribing would mean the world to us because we spent a lot of time making this narrative and getting it ready to tell. We will return to the story now. As the sun rose higher in the sky, it illuminated Colonel Morrison's jacket with the metal pins. Rare metals that symbolized bravery, selflessness, and unity. What the Shadow Riders were about to discover was that power did not reside in sheer numbers or fear, but rather in the connections formed amongst fighters who had never lost sight of the cause for which they battled. Men and women who exuded subtle self-assurance around Axel's gang as he peered around the diner. No one here felt the need to demonstrate their mettle. They had previously established all the necessary elements at locations that lay beyond the reach of the average citizen. With a commanding voice, Colonel Morrison announced your option. However, be selective, there are some errors that cannot be repeated. A crescendo had been reached in the diner's tension. In the coming moments, the Shadow Riders will need to make a decision, either confront fighters who understood actual warfare or confess they were merely bullies pretending to be tough. In any case, today would change Eagle's Hollow forever. As she watched, Sarah knew that the best triumphs are not always won in fighting, but rather in the avoidance of defeat. The true conflict wasn't for land or honor, but rather over the very essence of a community that had endured an interminable period of terror. It was only the beginning of that war. Sarah, who had sat with the same composed precision that had led Special Forces teams through innumerable missions, caught Axel's eye as he raced from the veterans obstructing every exit to her. The sharp contrast between the veterans' controlled calm and the Shadow Riders' anxious energy is brought to light by the early light that filters through Betty's windows, casting harsh shadows steal the picture. Do you truly believe that numbers empower you? As he cautiously made his way around the eatery, Colonel Morrison examined each Shadow Rider individually. What follows is a description of difficult. Here, Captain Mitchell saved my crew from a Taliban ambush despite widespread fears that doing so would be suicidal, and she did it while flying under heavy fire for refusing to abandon anyone. The younger Shadow Riders began to show signs of recognition, which Sarah observed. Before becoming members of the gang, a handful of them had served. It was obvious in their body language, the automatic reaction to Morrison's authoritative presence. That lady you were attempting to scare off. Every seat in the diner could hear Morrison as he went on. She has more combat missions under her belt than all of your comrades put together. Those leather cuts have more medals than patches. With his former bluster fading, Stryker moved uncomfortably. Perhaps we ought to quiet down. The sharpness in Axel's voice had faded by the time he snapped. This area belongs to us. We refuse to budge. A wave of serenity washed steele the audience as James Mitchell spoke. Fear isn't the right way to claim territory, son. It is a reward for doing good deeds, being selfless, and serving others. The arrival of further soldiers echoed tales of victories achieved in locales that the average person could not even begin to fathom. With the deft coordination of trained professionals, they assumed positions that gave them the upper hand in the dining room. Months have passed with your group ravaging Eagle's Hollow. At last rising to her feet, Sarah moved with grace and composure. Putting people at danger in the comfort of their own homes while jeopardizing families and businesses. Is it true that you truly believed nobody would speak out? The gang scout, Spectre, was about to reach the entrance when two veterans, whose posture betrayed their military background, barred his way. We are encircled, boss. Not your average motorcyclist. Concerned, Hawk added. Dear boss, a few of them had Ranger tabs. Military patches. These are authentic. Morrison said, this is it, his tone indicating that he was issuing an order rather than a suggestion. Depart immediately. Do not return to Eagle's Hollow. Or discover the consequences of overtaxing skilled fighters. Sarah arrived just as Axel's hand moved toward his concealed handgun. She forcefully disarmed him by twisting his arm behind his back and forcing him face-first against the counter, drawing on her years of martial training. It took the gang boss a second to comprehend what had transpired because the movement was so fluid and expert. Is that the weapon you were aiming at? Sarah kept the hold going while keeping her voice casual. When you came in, I counted it. Including any and all weapons your soldiers may be carrying. The blade stashed in blade spurs. while concealing the brass knuckles fool specter. On his left pocket, Hawk carries the switchblade. Our eyes are wide open. Nobody else among the veterans had budged. Felt unnecessary too. Everyone understood. Since there was no battle whatsoever, it could not have been considered fair. A lesson was learned. Are you aware of the distinction that separates us from you? Morrison inquired, speaking to the whole gang. We can be tough without having to prove it. Defeating foes who would make most people run screaming to their moms, we proved it in locations you've never heard of. It was possible to see further bikes pulling up through the windows. Not gang members, but veterans from the area who had heard the rallying cry. Veterans were determined not to allow their hometown to be overrun by renegade thugs posing as fighters. Observing the situation with a blend of dread and optimism, Betty had come out of the kitchen. In defiance of the Shadow Riders, her diner refused to pay their protection money, making it one of the last remaining establishments. She finally grasped the reasoning for Sarah and James's choice of this particular site for their morning meals. What comes up after this is this. Just a little shove from Sarah set Axel free, and he stumbled back into Blade's arms. You will go from Eagle's Hollow with your gang and your intimidating presence, seeking a new location to engage in imaginative play. Or, while Axel's voice trembled somewhat, he attempted to come a Steele as rebellious. Alternately, Morrison advanced. Here we demonstrate the distinction between biker thugs and real combat veterans. The decision is yours. All of a sudden, one of the teenage Shadow Riders undid his leather cut. When he separated from his old brethren, the patches and colors of the gang splattered around the floor. That is all. 2 tours in Iraq were my duty. I fought for something better than this. Something was ignited by his deeds. Still another rider took off his bandage. Next, yet another. As further gang members decided to leave the life they had been leading, the diner was filled with the sound of leather slamming on linoleum. How dare you! As he witnessed his gang disintegrate in front of his eyes, Axel yelled, but his words had no impact. James spoke up, his blind eyes pinpointing Axel with pinpoint accuracy. After I did everything for you, but you did nothing for them. Some of these people were veterans who had lost hope in humanity, and you transformed them into their enemy. No one can call that a leader. Corruption exists there. At this point in the morning, the light had fully risen, removing the long shadows and revealing the reality of the situation. It was about more than just confronting a gang. What these men had lost in the process of losing their dignity and respect was something important that had to be regained. As Sarah observed, flashbacks to similar instances in battle came flooding back, highlighting the stark contrast between right and wrong. It wasn't always about vanquishing an adversary, sometimes it was about guiding them to a better way. What you see now in Betty's home cuisine is only the start of the change. The Shadow Riders were about to find out that actual power had nothing to do with leather jacket patches, and Eagle's Hollow was about to find out what occurred when genuine fighters chose to rise up. As more and more Shadow Riders decided to leave the band, the heap of used leather snippets on Betty's restaurant floor became even greater. As Axel saw his authority dwindle, he couldn't help but notice a new expression in his eyes, a mix of anger and incredulity. Fear. Not of violence, but of losing control. He turned and snarled as he retreated toward the exit. Think a little rough talk and some combat stories will make a difference. On these streets, the Shadow Riders reign supreme. Take a look about you, Sarah said, pointing to his gang mates from before. Lost men who have regained their sense of self are all that remain of the Shadow Riders. Sheriff Wilson's patrol cruiser pulled up alongside the assembled veterans' bikes, as seen through the windows. Following the resolution of the issue by the actual peacekeepers, the law enforcement agencies came. The sheriff stormed into the diner and proclaimed, "You're under arrest, Axel. I have the proof and the witnesses to put you away for good." The charges are piling up, including extortion, assault, and weapons allegations. Colonel Morrison sprang to his feet. "Sheriff, I have an idea that would pique everyone's curiosity before you take him." The restaurant went dark as Morrison spoke to the departing Shadow Riders. "You are mostly veterans. You did your country proud once. You lost track of its meaning sometime in the process. You still have time to keep in mind." Immediately, Sarah noticed Morrison's actions. It had been previously, providing a passage back for wandering warriors, and she remembered seeing it. The chance to learn from their mistakes was the same one she had offered to innumerable warriors in war zones. Morrison went on to say that the Veterans Alliance offers a rehabilitation program that includes things like counseling, support services, job training, and a chance to be a part of something worthwhile again. His remarks caused some of the ex-gang members to immediately stand up straight, their posture taking on a more military appearance. Realizing that some of the individuals in his care required more than just punishment, the sheriff observed with thoughtfulness. A sense of direction was necessary for them. "Where do we stand with our fees?" With a tinge of hope that he couldn't quite suppress, Spectre asked. Sheriff Wilson's response was to cooperate with the oversight probe into Axel. "Assist us in removing the debris that you contributed to. Let us know that you're committed to making a change, and we'll figure it out." Carrying a mug of freshly brewed coffee, Betty came from the kitchen, her trembling hands now completely gone. Her diner had gone through a metamorphosis that morning, becoming a sanctuary where repentance could take root. To everyone's surprise, she proclaimed that you're all welcome here. As veterans returning home, rather than as Shadow Riders. We could certainly need more watchmen in this town, preferably with a better grasp of the meaning of that term. The former gang members were addressed by James Mitchell, whose voice bore the weight of decades of leadership experience. "Remembering your identity after the combat ceases is more difficult than any conflict a warrior may encounter. For a while, some of you were on the losing end of that fight, now is your chance to get it back." Axel's sharp chuckle shattered the silence. "The powerful get what they want, and you all are pitiful and feeble." Sarah calmly answered with a no, capturing the attention of everyone present. "At this very moment, Eagle's Hollow requires protection against those like you, who conflate brutality with authority, because only the powerful can safeguard what is important." As one by one, the ex-Shadow Riders took advantage of the opportunity. Morrison described the rehabilitation program in detail while Sheriff Wilson started recording statements to document the gang's illicit operations. Morrison cautioned them that this would be more difficult than anything they had faced while in the gang. "Rather than demanding toughness, we ask that you be honorable. More bravery is required for that than for any violent deed. A lovely fall day has blossomed outside since the morning." For those who wanted to enroll in the program, the assembled veterans started making transportation arrangements. A glimmer of hope was rekindled in eyes that had long since died as plans were shared and promises were made. While James collected himself to finish his iced coffee, Sarah observed from her booth. "Do you think they'll be able to make it?" she whispered. "Some will, and some won't," was James's response. "Like the soldiers in Kandahar, they all deserve a chance. It only takes one person to have faith in you sometimes." With a smile that hadn't been seen in months, Betty delivered freshly brewed coffee. "Today, we're covering both of your breakfast costs. From what I can tell, you've been keeping this area safe the whole time." Despite Sarah's response, just doing what needed doing, her father's hand was warmly squeezed. The two of them were wise enough to know that violent activities were not always necessary to safeguard others. While Axel was being escorted in handcuffs, his once great empire teetering on the edge of collapse, Eagle's Hollow was poised for dramatic change. Even though the Shadow Riders had met their end, a new force was emerging from their demise. A group of brave warriors who have vowed to defend the very people they previously terrorized. There was still more fighting to be done for Eagle's Hollow, but the first battle had been won not by violence nor weaponry, but by the calm fortitude of those who remembered the cause for which they had fought. With the winds of redemption and the unbreakable links of individuals who had faced the horrors of war but had decided to rise above them, the little town was about to undergo a real transformation. An eerie stillness pervaded Eagles Hollow as the sun rose the following day. In spite of everything that happened the day before, Sarah and James stuck to their pattern and ate Betty's homemade meals. But now things were different. A timid optimism had taken the place of the tension that had encircled the eatery for months. As Sarah meticulously arranged her father's silverware, she mentioned that she had received a call from Morrison earlier today. The first session of the program drew 15 former Shadow Riders, which was more than we had anticipated. As James placed his fingers on his coffee cup, he nodded attentively. The rest? Wanting to make amends on their own terms, 3 of them departed the town, while the other 4 handed themselves in to the sheriff. Everything else? As Betty came over bearing freshly brewed coffee, Sarah halted. While the others fill their cups and contemplate whether or not change is truly achievable, Betty finishes for her. The diner's windows provided a view of Morrison's group veterans who were guarding the streets rather than occupying them. They made their presence known. Now there were warriors guarding Eagles Hollow who knew what it meant to serve. Sarah continued, her tactical mind constantly scanning for possible dangers, and Axel will be transferred to state custody today. He faces enough charges from the sheriff to likely spend years behind bars. They were drawn to the sound of a motorbike's engine. As I drove up outside, the ex-Shadow Rider's scout known as Spectre appeared. He rode his bike into the diner after he sat there for a long time, mulling about some inner decision. "Sir," he spoke to James face to face, his voice heavy with remorse. "Sorry, ma'am. I come to make amends. My actions and ours. That's not acceptable." James averted his gaze from the ex-gang member. "I can always find an excuse, my son. Whether you're prepared to surpass your justifications is the question." As Spectre set something down on their table, his hand quivered ever so slightly. "Relics from his time as a Shadow Rider. Responsibility is the first step, according to Colonel Morrison. I would like to rectify the situation." Sarah looked closely at the ex-scout, able to see beyond his tattoos and leather to the wounded soldier lying beneath. "I am not promising a simple task. Nothing the community accomplished that night will escape the memory of the Shadow Riders." Spectre acknowledged my point, but perhaps they will recall our next move. "Morrison has enlisted my help in establishing a Veterans Outreach Center, suggesting that I use my people-finding abilities to identify struggling veterans rather than intimidating them." Spectre was unexpectedly given a coffee by Betty. After being terrified of the ex-gang member at first, she eventually came to cautiously accept him. The diner was becoming more than simply a place to eat. A symbol of the town's promise for healing, it was taking shape. Further motorbikes drew up outside. As soon as Sarah caught sight of Stryker's towering figure, who was now flanked by 2 veterans from Morrison's squad, her body stiffened up. They were making their way to the former warehouse district, which had recently been transformed into the headquarters of the rehabilitation program. According to Spectre, today they will be clearing out the old Shadow Riders clubhouse. "Before we can create a new tomorrow, Morrison thinks we must confront our history." In his response, James spoke with the authority that comes with years of command. "Coming home is the most difficult mission a soldier can face. Along the road, some of us become disoriented. Whether a fighter falls or not is less important than the fortitude it takes to climb back up." Sarah saw additional fugitives from the gang show up at the warehouse, prepared to destroy the monument to their criminal past. The burden of their transgressions and the hope of atonement rested on each man's shoulders. As Betty refilled their glasses, she brought up the fact that the town council was meeting tonight. The Veterans Center is being considered for approval. People still feel afraid and believe this is only a momentary situation. Sarah made the astute observation that individuals are more likely to believe in change if they are shown what it looks like, even if change is inherently frightening. They could observe the start of the change via the windows of the restaurant. As a team, veterans and ex-gang members are removing trash from the warehouse. Redeeming themselves was made easier with each component of the demolished clubhouse. Spectre whispered that he has heard rumors in other towns. This is being watched by other gangs. It is unlike anything anybody has ever witnessed. Transformation of adversaries into friends for veterans. Sarah grasped the importance. In addition to altering its own destiny, Falcon's Hollow was paving the way for other towns to follow in the wake of its success or failure. The consequences of their deeds would extend well beyond the boundaries of the municipality. Morrison wants me to speak to the council tonight, Spectre said, his voice betraying his growing anxiety. Share our tale and the reasons behind our decision to take a new route. Then, as James had recommended, give them the truth. Concerning both your mistakes and your efforts to rectify them. Mistakes are forgiven, my son. The bravery to tell them how they're wrong is what they need to witness. Moment by moment, the weight of possibility hung over the grieving as it unfolded. Demolition noises in the warehouse district signaled the end of the Shadow Riders' terrifying rule. Numerous ex-gang members showed up to the police station, opting to face consequences rather than remain hidden. Sarah kept the same level of calculated awareness that had helped her survive in war zones as she observed everything. Now this was a war of a different kind. For the love of a community, not for control of land or power. Instead of weapons like guns or threats, what was needed were honesty, bravery, and a steadfast hope that things could get better. Doubt it will endure. As Betty saw another contingent of veterans lead formerly incarcerated individuals to the warehouse, she whispered a question. As long as they keep in mind why they're fighting, Sarah said, it will endure. Being a member of something greater than oneself is more important than having power or being afraid. A worthy cause is what every soldier needs. New shadows were cast astill, a town in transition as the sun ascended over Eagle's Hollow. The battleground had changed, but the fight itself had not ended. The actual labor started now, with veterans guiding guys through the daily effort to overcome their biggest shortcomings and learn from their failures. As residents of the municipality flocked to the community center for the council meeting, darkness descended upon Eagle's Hollow. As the inmates confronted their old oppressors, the room was filled to capacity and tension ran high. There was a group of company owners who had been victims of the Shadow Riders' extortion tactics. On the flip side, Morrison's program veterans are escorted by formerly gang members. With her keen tactical awareness, Sarah placed her father's chair in the room's front, making note of every possible departure and flashpoint. Everything they had begun to construct would be put to the test the following night. Please place your order. The muttering were silenced as Mayor Thompson's gavel slammed on the wood. Colonel Morrison has proposed a veterans rehabilitation facility in the former warehouse district, and we are here to talk about it. Spectre took the lead, removing all gang patches from his leather jacket and replacing them with a single American flag pin. Although his speech was audible, his hands quivered slightly when he addressed the audience. I am aware that the majority of you despise us, he started out straight. You are fully within your rights to. The violence, threats, and terror that we inflicted upon this town as Shadow Riders were completely unacceptable. It can't be excused. In a fit of rage, hardware shop owner Tom Wilson rose to his feet. You scared my family and smashed my windows. For what reason may we assume that things have changed? Reason being, they are not apologizing. Colonel Morrison sprang to his feet. Instead of just saying it, they want an opportunity to prove it. Betty stood up from her seat, holding the coffee pot that she had served during the discussion. I was able to fix my delivery entrance with the help of 3 of them yesterday. It was the same door they broke into last month. They toiled away all day, but nobody would pay them $1. At the last possible moment, a voice rose from the assembly. The rising tension was abruptly broken by James Mitchell's voice just before this vote. During my time in service, I gained valuable insight into the concept of atonement. Instead of trying to erase the past, we can choose a new future. Sarah noticed a change in the atmosphere of the room when her father spoke. Respecting the words of the blind soldier, even those who were opposed to the rehabilitation center remained silent. James went on to say that these guys had gone astray. In the same way that many soldiers do upon returning home. That they're actively seeking it out again is the key distinction. We muster the bravery to assist them in deserving a second opportunity. The question is not whether they deserve one or not. The next to move forward was Blade, who stood taller than the majority of the room. The Shadow Riders had me as an enforcer 3 days ago. I returned from the war in Afghanistan, the same conflict that blinded Mr. Mitchell, and am now coping with post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, through the VA's treatment program. Forward learned Mayor Thompson. Is there any assurance that this isn't simply another ploy to penetrate our community? Standing by her father's side, Sarah responded, "You don't. However, survey the room at large. All of us veterans have committed to keeping an eye on this program, providing guidance and support to the men involved, and making sure they don't stray from the road they've chosen." Additional motorbikes were visible through the windows as they awaited their arrival. Folks who had heard rumors about Eagles Hollow's transformation attempt, veterans from nearby towns, not gang members. Even outside their borders, support was on the rise. The warehouse will serve as more than just a rehabilitation center, as Colonel Morrison clarified. Veterans will be able to use it as a resource, and families of service members will be able to get counseling services and emergency aid. Redemption isn't the only thing these men are after. A component of the solution is being formed by them. With his grip on the folder now more secure, Spectre withdrew it. 20 different local firms have already committed to hiring. You need an inventory clerk at your hardware store, Tom. From their time in the military, I have 3 men who have expertise in logistics. As Spectre went on to describe the ways in which veteran skills may be put to use in the community, astonishment spread around the group. It wasn't like the Shadow Riders were only thugs. Beloved warriors who had gone astray, their skills invaluable. It's about more than just us. The voice of a younger, ex-gang member broke through. Additional veterans are observing. Individuals going through the same stuff as we did. This might serve as an example for them. Prove to them that there is a path back from the brink. Without trying, Sarah took a position in the room center, where she effortlessly demanded attention. You were adversaries with these men 2 days ago. On this day, they have made the conscious decision to become your neighbors, guardians, and fellow citizens. More bravery is required for that than for any violent deed. The mayor looked around at the expressions of the people gathered there, veterans standing guard, hardened men humbling themselves, and townspeople struggling with forgiveness. Maybe we ought to vote on it. Remember something before you do, James said, interrupting. How a town handles its heroes isn't indicative of its character. It's the way it deals with people who are trying to obtain forgiveness that matters. These brave souls served their nation in the past. Their own souls are at stake now. How will we respond? Will we side with them or fight against them? Upon the distribution of ballots, the room grew hushed. Sarah witnessed the real-life conflict between people's fears and their hopes as they grappled with decision-making. A structure or a program wasn't the only thing that prompted this vote. It centered on Falcon's Hollow's chosen character as a town. With the final vote cast, Betty rose to her feet once more. No matter what, my restaurant welcomes anyone trying to put things right. Everybody has to begin somewhere. Counting started. Falcon's Hollow's future is brighter with every graded paper. It was now up to the very individuals the Shadow Riders had frightened in the past to bring about the change that had begun with that one phone call. Sarah tenderly grasped her father's shoulder. No matter the outcome, they had shown these men a new way. Voting was not the true measure of success. The decision these ex-gang members made to approach their victims and request a second opportunity, rather than forgiveness, was the key. There were tremors in the community center as a result of the final vote total. 27 in favor, 25 against, and 3 abstentions. It was a razor-thin margin that had decided the fate of the Veterans Rehabilitation Center. Once Mayor Thompson's gavel sank, it was officially made. However, the actual labor had only just started. The people's lingering resentment for their erstwhile oppressors was mirrored by the chilly October evening outside. As the audience broke up, Sarah could see the residual divisions. The business owners gathered together, the former Shadow Riders stood aside, and the veterans attempted to bring the two groups together. As Spectre discreetly joined Sarah and James, she noted that they seemed frightened. "Not sure I blame them. We made it easy for them to be." Near their motorcycles, Colonel Morrison rounded up the ex-gang members. "The warehouse will be cleared tomorrow morning at 0600. In order to gain the trust of this town, we must dismantle every component of the Shadow Riders' history." As he nervously approached the gathering, Tom Wilson jingled the keys to his hardware business. "There are 3 available slots, and I meant what I said. Nonetheless, stepping out of line once is enough." Blade confidently informed him, standing up straighter, that we won't. "You're allowing us an opportunity. We don't deserve that." Sarah perceived motion in the darkness, which she interpreted as additional ex-Shadow Riders observing from a distance. Outside of the confines of the council room, the vote had sent a signal. If one wanted to see change, they would have to work for it. Heard back from the state police. Sheriff Wilson walked over to join them, the spotlight reflecting off his badge. Axel's communicating, divulging identities, and places. The Shadow Riders network is falling apart. Steele 3 counties. Upon seeing a distant sound, James inclined his head to listen. More bikes coming. The rumble of motorcycles grew louder as a group of riders approached, not gang members or veterans, but leaders from other motorcycle clubs in the region. They'd come to witness what was happening in Falcon's Hollow. "There will be no going back now," one of them said, dismounting. "Other gangs are watching. Some of our own members, veterans themselves, are asking questions we can't answer." Morrison stepped forward. "Maybe it's time for those questions to be asked. How many veterans in your clubs are struggling? How many joined looking for the brotherhood they lost after service?" Betty emerged from the community center, thermoses of coffee in hand. "Meeting's over, but my diner's open. Seems to me this is a conversation that needs having." The group migrated to Betty's, former enemies sitting together in booths that had seen yesterday's confrontation. Sarah positioned herself where she could watch both the door and the street. "Old habits dying hard. It won't be easy," one of the club leaders warned. "Some will resist. Change scares people." "Should scare them," James replied, his blind eyes somehow finding the speaker. "Change means admitting you were wrong. Takes more courage than any fight." Spectre spread blueprints of the warehouse. Steele a table. "We're not just building a rehabilitation center. We're building a model, something other towns can follow." The plans showed more than just offices and meeting rooms. There were spaces for job training, counseling centers, family support services, a place where veterans could find their way back from whatever darkness had claimed them. "Town split on this," Sheriff Wilson noted, studying the faces around the diner. "One wrong move, one slip-up for many of you, and it all falls apart." Sarah watched another group of former Shadow Riders enter the diner hesitantly. They were younger, their gang patches already removed. The vote had given them permission to hope for something different. "Which is why we start small," Morrison explained. "Community service projects, public works, show the town actions, not promises." Through the windows, they could see more veterans arriving. Word was spreading about Eagles Hollow's experiment in redemption. Every hour brought new allies, new challenges, new opportunities to prove that change was possible. "Received a call from the VA," Morrison continued. "They're interested in studying our program, think it could be replicated nationally." Betty refilled coffee cups, moving among former enemies with practiced ease. You know what I think? Sometimes it takes darkness to show us where the light needs to be. The night deepened around Eagles Hollow, but inside Betty's diner, something remarkable was taking shape. Members of the gang who had previously terrorized local businesses now worked together on community improvement initiatives. War stories told by veterans helped young men who had wandered from the road to honor. Sarah tenderly grasped her father's shoulder. Does it seem like it will be effective? After all, it is, James said, indicating toward the background noise of people talking. Hey, that's not a scream of terror anymore. There's optimism in that sound. More veterans, ex-gang members looking for redemption, and onlookers to the change starting in this tiny town showed up outside on motorbikes. What began as a contentious vote was turning out to be the first genuine steps toward healing by the end of the night. Although the battle for the soul of Eagles Hollow had not ended, the terrain had changed. Instead of using threats and violence, the fight would now be waged via acts of service, daily decisions, and the quiet bravery of men who choose to learn from their mistakes and become better versions of themselves. New developments in that conflict were being plotted in Betty's diner while indulging in seemingly endless cups of coffee. A group of ex-night riders gathered at the warehouse as the sun rose above Eagles Hollow, their breaths caught in the brisk morning air. What had been the old clubhouse, a symbol of their terrible rule, was set to change into something totally new. With a military demeanor that had not changed since his days in war, Colonel Morrison stood before them. His first order of business was to take stock of everyone there. You put these on when you're on the job. He distributed safety vests that were a brilliant shade of yellow and bore the name Veterans Community Service A Steel the back. It is time for others to stop viewing you as an issue and start seeing you as an asset. From her truck, with James sitting next to her, Sarah saw the spectacle. They observed as Spectre and Blade, who were once brothers, guided their erstwhile companions in removing the Night Riders' emblems from the building's exterior. They felt a corresponding relief as they let go of more and more of their history. As Sarah pointed out, got movement, her keen tactical awareness revealing what others had overlooked. Onlookers from the neighborhood watched the metamorphosis with a mix of intrigue and distrust. The only way for them to understand is to see it for themselves, James said, to observe the transformation taking place. There was more than just Betty when her vehicle arrived, laden with breakfast sandwiches and coffee. The truck from Tom Wilson's hardware store, which was filled with donated materials for the refurbishment, trailed behind. Delicate acts of trust, earned with difficulty and precariousness. Spectre, his voice creaking with anticipation, spoke out as a delivery truck approached. They had negotiated the price of protection using the same truck a few weeks before. As the vehicle decelerated in front of the warehouse, a mix of panic and recognition steeled his face. As he advanced, Blade's enormous frame exuded a new type of might. "Come on, sir, we'll help you unload." Simple people helping out their neighbors, with no strings attached. Years of fear clashed with the terrifying sight ahead of the motorist, causing him to pause. With a last nod, he retracted his truck to the loading dock. He was soon having his luggage swiftly unloaded by a group of ex-night riders donning safety vests. "Do you see that?" To Sarah, Morrison whispered. Moment by moment, small successes. There was a metamorphosis happening within the warehouse. In order to gut the old interior, veterans with building knowledge instructed the former gang members. A therapy center would replace the bar where their illegal activities were plotted. A facility for job training would replace the back room that had previously stored illicit weapons. Sarah stated that she had guests as she saw 3 motorbikes coming. Come check if the stories were true, the bikers were sporting patches from a rival gang. Morrison advanced, his presence inspiring awe, while the previous night riders stiffened, their primal impulses resurfacing. Is your goal to observe or get knowledge? Looking around, the lead rider got off the horse. Rumors circulating. Some of our members, who are veterans like you mentioned, are inquiring. Perhaps now we can finally find out. With a shout that echoed over the lot, James finally spoke up. What will it take for us to lead these warriors back to safety after they've gone astray? The members of the rival gang observed the community members' gradual approach, the transformation taking place before their very eyes, and their erstwhile adversaries' continuous labor. While checking her phone, Betty declared that the town's painting project would begin today. Volunteers are needed by the Parks and Recreation Department. Spectre, perspiring profusely despite the chill, glanced up from his task. We will dispatch a group to demonstrate that we are capable of constructing rather than demolishing. Sarah watched as the former night riders dispersed, with some staying to finish renovating the warehouse and others going out to assist with community projects. Every man was donning his protective vest as if it were a novel form of armor. Morrison updated everyone on the situation at Tom's hardware store. Today, 3 former members began working, claiming to have arrived early and were enthusiastic about learning. More and more locals, enticed by wonder or cautious optimism, made their way to the warehouse throughout the morning. Seeing the guys who had frightened them now helping to heal the emotional and physical harm they had caused was a shocking sight. As Sheriff Wilson arrived with documentation, he revealed that he had received a call from the VA. What we're doing here might be replicated in other places, so they're sending a team next week to document it. As if on cue, voices shouted out measurements and directions, breaking the silence with the clatter of saws and hammers. Even while change was challenging, it wasn't impossible, and the warehouse was starting to represent that. Do you recall anything regarding warfare? Sarah spoke softly to her dad. Sometimes it's not the battle itself that's the hardest part, but rather the rebuilding that follows. As he listened to the sounds of rebuilding, James gave a nod. At this point in time, these warriors are engaged in a new form of conflict, one in which the acquisition of trust is more important than the control of land. The warehouse's makeover was plain to see from the street by noon. Walls that had been cleaned and were prepared for a new function have replaced the menacing exterior of the Shadow Riders. Meanwhile, people of the community who had been onlookers started delivering food and drink to the workers. Morrison noted that it was beginning. Bit by bit, it's beginning. Their transformation from terrifying monsters to men seeking change is starting to register with the public. Veterans from nearby towns showed up, ready to lend a hand and share stories. Beyond simple renovation, the warehouse project was taking on new dimensions. An example of what may happen when a group of people prioritize forgiveness over vengeance, it was quickly growing into a movement. Sarah kept the same level of calculated awareness that had helped her survive in war zones as she observed everything. Instead of guns and bloodshed, this triumph was achieved with hammers, paintbrushes, and the resolve to improve upon each day. More difficulties lay ahead, and the day was far from over. Falcon's Hollow, however, was experiencing firsthand the transformative force of a heaping pile of abandoned gang insignia on the emerging framework of something new. A life transformed with a single nail, a single action. The VA evaluation group showed up on a brisk Monday morning in Falcon's Hollow in official VA vehicles, which stood in sharp contrast to the private automobiles parked in Betty's lot. While veterans and former night riders enjoyed coffee and discussion, the team's head researcher, Dr. Eleanor Chen, sat a steal from Sarah and James with her laptop open. As she reviewed her preliminary data, Dr. Chen was impressed by what you had achieved in only 2 weeks. 80% reduction in neighborhood incident reports, 30 formerly incarcerated gang members engaged in counseling, and 15 of them found employment. As he entered the diner, Sarah noticed that Spectre had changed into his hardware shop uniform, khakis and a collared shirt. You could see the change in their demeanor as much as in what they did. In response, James told Dr. Chen that numbers don't reveal everything. A man's heart can't be quantified through numbers. They could observe Blade guiding a band of ex-night riders as they fixed Mrs. Henderson's fence, the very fence they had smashed months earlier, through the windows. There was progress toward redemption with every act of repair. No one has tried this approach before, Dr. Chen added, adding that there are similar problems in numerous of towns, with veteran heavy motorcycle gangs, escalating violence, and communities living in fear. The general public views punishment as the sole solution, therefore Colonel Morrison decided to join them right after morning patrol. They failed to remember that fallen heroes require redemption for their former selves, not merely condemnation of their current selves. Betty paused to share her insights as she brought fresh coffee. I froze as I opened my door 2 weeks ago. Helping me unload supplies are some ex-gang members who are now refusing to take money. According to them, it's all a part of making up. Members of the neighborhood, as well as veterans and past night riders, were interviewed by the VA team as they circulated through the restaurant. A picture of transformation began to take shape as each story contributed new details. Sarah noticed that there were visitors, and her keen tactical awareness allowed her to see 3 motorbikes pulling up with gang patches from the neighboring county. However, these riders had no intention of causing trouble. It was their purpose to comprehend. Spectre was waiting for them outside. He has gone from being the night rider's scout to his new position as program coordinator. Want to witness it for yourself? A rider who had served in Vietnam nodded as they were led. I have received word about the current situation. We have club members who are curious about change and want to know more. As she took notes, Dr. Chen saw the exchange via the window. Already, the rippling impact is beginning. As a result, other gangs are keeping an eye on things to see if they can learn anything. Sheriff Wilson briefed the VA team on recent incidents while they were in the diner. The decrease in crime is only one aspect. Reports of other gangs' actions have been on the rise. These brave men are assisting us in averting potential acts of violence. Nodding to the people who had worked as night riders but were now employees at his store, Tom Wilson came for his morning coffee. I never would have guessed, but such people are among my most valuable employees. Punctuality, and respect for clients are essential. James elaborated by saying that it's because they have a point to prove. They have an opportunity to regain the trust they lost with every interaction. Additional motorcyclists, including veterans from 3 different states who had heard about Eagles Hollow's program, arrived and disrupted the gathering. Knowing that others looking for solutions would benefit from hearing about their model, Morrison went to meet them. Sarah told Dr. Chen that it's more than just giving them another opportunity that matters. They are being shown the way to earn it. There is a veteran mentor, a career coach, and therapy, structure, purpose, and accountability for every former night rider. The diner's windows provided a view of the ongoing warehouse refurbishment. The intimidating facade of the old clubhouse had been replaced by an inviting air of professionalism, making it almost impossible to identify. Dr. Chen remarked that your success rate is unparalleled. However, what about the skeptics and dissenters? Morrison conceded that some ones won't survive. You have the power to choose to change. We can point the way, but it is ultimately up to them to choose to follow it. The diner known as Betty's Diner had evolved into something much more. A representation of the community's metamorphosis, it stood tall. Together, they ate and spoke, mending fences that had been shattered. Dr. Chen disclosed that the VA is contemplating rolling out comparable programs on a national scale. Rehabilitating gang members who have served their country includes utilizing veterans. But do explain how you made it work in this case. As he responded, James's voice resounded with wisdom. You succeeded because you kept in mind an important detail. There is usually a lone soldier yearning for the camaraderie they experienced while serving their country behind every violent crime and gang patch. Sarah observed several automobiles pulling up. Reporters, authorities from nearby towns, veterans seeking help on beginning their own programs. Redemption wasn't merely conceivable, Eagles Hollow was rising to the occasion as a symbol of hope. It quickly spread. Spectre told the VA team that the hardest thing isn't making the changes yourself. Others will see that the transformation is genuine because of this. Trust is something that needs to be earned again and again. As the morning progressed, the diner transformed into a classroom where Dr. Chen's crew recorded every detail as previous shadow riders shared their experiences of change. The story of how a tiny village might transform foes into friends became clearer with each witness account. Although the battle for the soul of Eagle's Hollow had not ended, the terrain had changed. It was now being fought with deeds of service, with decisions made every day, with the quiet bravery of men who chose to learn from their mistakes and become better. As the next chapter of that conflict was being penned in Betty's diner, countless cups of coffee were consumed. For all communities going through this tough time, not simply one particular town. The first true evaluation of Eagle's Hollow's metamorphosis occurred 3 weeks subsequent to the VA team's visit. With her battle-hardened instincts catching up. On minute shifts in the town's ambience, Sarah was the first to perceive the tension. Long lines of waiting cars outside the warehouse, strange people observing the community service projects of the former Shadow Riders, and hushed chatter that ceased as the veterans drew near. Visiting Axel is his cousin. While they were having coffee at Betty's in the morning, Sheriff Wilson told her about Logan Steele. He is unhappy at the fate of the Shadow Riders and has connections to 3 other gangs. As they left the diner, the patrons could make out Spectre and Blade on their way to work, donning their work attire rather than their trademark leather cuts. Despite the obvious difference between their former selves and the men they had become, not everyone was open to the idea of second chances. Morrison said, "Got reports of bikers gathering 2 towns over, while laying a map steal the table. It appears that Logan is attempting to arrange something by phoning around for favors." With his blind eyes fixed on the window, James sat silently. The true test is already within Eagle's Hollow, it isn't coming from the outside. That man was absolutely correct. There was increasing resistance, even though the initiative had been successful. Meetings had been going on among a group of banking district business owners headed by Richard Palmer, who had argued that rehabilitated gang members couldn't be trusted. A town hall meeting is scheduled for this evening. Refilling coffee cups, Betty instructed them. Although Palmer is referring to it as a community safety discussion, its true nature is obvious to everyone. In response to Morrison's subdued plea for assistance, Sarah saw several veterans show up. They arrived incognito, quietly assuming positions around town to be prepared for action. Spectre, who had overheard the conversation, observed that there was one point on which Mr. Palmer was correct. Everyone in town must feel secure. Perhaps we should speak up at the meeting and reveal our true selves. That night, the town hall was packed. With their jaws set in a resolute skepticism, Palmer and his followers sat side by side. While their seasoned instructors sat to one side, the ex-Shadow Riders remained dressed in their professional attire. All the while, the average townie waited to see which vision for the future of their town would win out. Palmer took the stage to tell the audience that these individuals are wanted felons. A couple of months of excellent conduct won't make up for years of fear. This program is endangering our families because of these violent individuals. Sarah grabbed Morrison's arm just as he began to stand up. Veterans couldn't have fought this kind of combat. It was necessary for the ex-Shadow Riders to express themselves. With a voice that betrayed his years of experience, Spectre rose slowly to his feet. "One thing Mr. Palmer is correct about is that we pose a threat. Our battle experience and military training allowed us to be effective soldiers. But instead of utilizing those talents to safeguard this community, we unleashed our anger and confusion upon returning home." As Spectre went on, everyone in the room went silent. "Recalling our actions is not something we are requesting. We're pleading with you to perceive our aspirations. Each and every one of the projects we finish, fences we repair, and deliveries we assist with is done in your presence. It goes beyond merely repairing things. It's about re-establishing our credibility." Palmer made a jest. "What will happen when you finish your rehabilitation program? When will the veterans cease to observe you? Do you really think we'll hold you accountable for not reverting to your previous behavior?" Standing next to him was Stryker, whose hardware store attire made his enormous frame seem less intimidating. A juvenile made an attempt to rob Tom's store 3 weeks prior. My former self would have caused him pain. He was the son of a veteran, and I spoke to him instead. His family is struggling while his father is away. Currently, he is a part of our juvenile mentorship program, and his mother is receiving assistance from the VA. As more and more ex-Shadow Riders spoke about their experiences, Sarah noticed a change in the energy of the room. Not only did each witness demonstrate growth, but they also acknowledged their own shortcomings, the damage they had done, and the importance of repairing the trust that had been broken. Sheriff Wilson made an announcement about something more that you should be aware of. Logan Steele is targeting more than simply motorcyclists. He intends to bring the Shadow Riders back to life and get things back to the way they were. There has been pressure and threats for each of these individuals to return. They aren't only choose to alter their ways. The fact that it might ruin their lives isn't stopping them from going for it. The room was rocked by the revelation. When Palmer realized that the men he had come to distrust were now protecting Eagle's Hollow from the threat that threatened to reassert its terror, he appeared surprised, too. James stood tall, commanding attention with his composed demeanor. Choosing a side when the battle lines are obvious isn't the hardest test for a warrior. It's about refusing to give in when giving in would be easier. These guys aren't your average ex-convicts. Veterans who have served their country are rediscovering the sacred vows they took, to defend their nation and its citizens from enemies both familiar and foreign. Unexpectedly, Betty was the next to walk forward. It took me 3 months to get over my fear of opening my diner. Nighttime security guards, who I used to mistrust, are now helping my senior customers to their cars and unloading deliveries. They're evolving beyond mere change. We are also being shown how to change by them. Ways to have faith in salvation. Additional motorbikes were visible through the windows as they awaited their arrival. Not members of the gang, but veterans reacting to Logan Steele's increasing danger. They were now guarding Eagle's Hollow and would not allow it to go to darkness. The vote is with you, Morrison told the audience. Keep in mind that confronting your opponents isn't always the path to the most courageous moments. The key is to provide them the opportunity to form an alliance. Sarah observed the community grappling with its hopes, anxieties, and forgiveness capacity as the town hall meeting progressed. Rather than using violence or threats, the true struggle for Eagle's Hollow was waged via the everyday decision to have faith in the potential for transformation. The settlement at the Steel Roads was lit up by the setting sun. Both the past and the future appeared poised, as if on the verge of a sudden shift. At that crucial juncture, Eagle's Hollow demonstrated to the world something truly extraordinary, that the most resilient societies are often formed not by eradicating darkness, but by guiding it toward its illumination. After the town hall meeting, Eagle's Hollow waited anxiously for what would happen next. Something unexpected had come out of the confrontation, but Logan Steele's threat was still there like a looming storm cloud. Unity. Palmer's stance had unintentionally brought the former Shadow Riders closer to the community they had sworn to defend. Sarah observed as Spectre and Blade coordinated security patrols with proprietors of nearby businesses from Betty's window. Their former enemies were now their allies in the fight against whatever was to come. Sheriff Wilson stated that Logan contacted Sarah and James at their customary booth. Claims to be offering the betrayed a final opportunity to come back to the fold. After that, he says there will be results. James, with a worn expression, pondered while he savored his coffee. What was their reaction? Everyone was represented by Blade. Yes, Morrison said. Disseminating a map depicting the current movements of gangs. Claimed to have discovered a cause worthy of their fight. An authentic experience. They could observe the town's metamorphosis from the windows of the eatery. In its newfound role as a symbol of optimism, the warehouse had previously represented terror. A model of rehabilitation that was gaining national recognition was developed through the collaborative efforts of veterans and ex-gang members, who taught job skills and offered counseling. As Betty made her announcement, she brought new coffee and word had come from 3 additional communities. They're launching comparable initiatives, following our model, the effects are trickling out. They were all bracing for what was sure to come, and Sarah's tactical mind was already studying patterns. Logan isn't going to assault head-on. He'll play on the community's insecurities by trying to undermine the trust we've established. Richard Palmer, his face red with rage, stormed into the diner, as if to corroborate her statements. They've returned. The threats and harassment have resumed. The air was heavy with Morrison's imposing presence as he rose to his feet. What transpired? The bank was targeted by vandals last night. Like in the past, gang emblems are painted all over. Palmer used the window as a weapon to accuse Blade and Spectre. This whole rehabilitation charade was an elaborate pretense. However, Sarah had previously detected an anomaly in Palmer's account. People failed to see nuances that her combat-trained eyes picked up on. No one with any expertise painted those symbols. They are an overly neat and precise bunch. The imitator is attempting to pull off gang tags. With a nod, Sheriff Wilson retrieved his phone and displayed images. Everything was captured by the security cameras. This kind of response is exactly what happens when Logan's men attempt to frame our reformed members. The more evidence Palmer examined, the less inflated his wrath became. At the time of the damage, the ex-Shadow Riders he had accused were a Steel Town, helping with the renovations to the community center. The authority in James's voice betrayed his concern that they were attempting to drive a wedge between us. Unite us in opposition. The age-old strategy of divide and conquer in battle. Spectre stepped into the eatery while clad in his hardware shop job attire. Mr. Palmer, we are eager to lend a hand in the cleanup effort so that the town can see our true colors. Upon seeing the genuineness of Spectre's offer, the banker's opposition dissolved. There was a growing number of ex-Shadow Riders congregating outside, all prepared to show their dedication to the community by doing, not just talking. Morrison said that Logan is bewildered by the situation. He thinks he's taking on a betrayal-plagued gang, but what he's actually up against is a community that has found faith in redemption. After some hesitation, Palmer eventually accepted Spectre's assistance, while Sarah watched. They marched toward the bank as one, their erstwhile rivals now standing united in the face of a shared danger. Apparently, there are more riders congregating. They were informed by Sheriff Wilson. We are also bolstering our forces, just like Logan. Viewed from the windows, they beheld returning soldiers from nearby towns, who had come not for bloodshed but to support a group that had the courage to attempt something new. Sarah had an epiphany: threats and fistfights won't win the war. At times like this, it is already being won. Each time we choose harmony instead of strife, faith instead of terror. As the number of protectors increased, Betty distributed sandwiches. Do you know my opinion? Since Logan is confused about his true enemy, he is unable to defeat him. Something larger is at play here than what he perceives as a struggle for control of land or power. With his blind sight perceiving more clearly than most, James nodded in agreement. It's about making amends and showing that everyone can change given the right circumstances. The air at Eagles Hollow was heavy with anticipation as night fell. Collaborating with locals, former Night Riders secured buildings, coordinated patrols, and fortified ties that Logan sought to weaken. On his way back from assisting at the bank, Blade noticed that we had something that he didn't have. We've moved past the control struggle. We're battling for our homeland. Knowing that Logan's challenge would put everything they had constructed to the test, Sarah watched the sun set over her changed village. It wasn't only a gang that Eagles Hollow was fighting. It meant fighting for the notion that people could find redemption, that groups could mend, and that adversaries could turn into allies. The struggle for the very essence of Eagles Hollow was nearing its climax. What Logan Steele was about to discover was that intimidating a fear-divided community was considerably easier than tearing apart one that was bound together by forgiveness and trust. At first light, Logan Steele struck, though not with the brutality that had been anticipated. He instead launched an assault using a considerably more sinister weapon. Reasons to doubt. Posters bearing the names and criminal records of each repentant night rider began popping up all around Eagles Hollow. The community was made privy to every incident of intimidation, theft, assault, and other crimes. Sarah discovered a contorted specter, his expression betraying his embarrassment, glancing at a leaflet outside Betty's diner. The paper detailed his darkest hours, the transgressions for which he had been seeking redemption. Spectre whispered to Sarah, "He's not wrong." Sarah was walking up to him. "I did everything that is listed here." Palmer might have been correct. Perhaps our history will always follow us. James, who was standing at the entrance of the diner with his cane, could be heard speaking. "Brother, you can't run away from your history. Its purpose is to teach." As the morning fog lifted, they could make out the silhouettes of other ex-night riders who were also having their names plastered all over town. Anger drove some to tear the flyers to shreds. With aching hearts, others stood and read them. Morrison, perusing one of the papers, admitted that this was clever. "They aren't the only ones Logan is attacking. He is compelling them to doubt their own judgment." A stack of flyers was clutched by Betty as she exited from her diner. Her expression changed from revulsion to resolve. "What did they leave out, by the way?" "Spectre always escorts my senior clients to their vehicles at the end of the day. The heist that Stryker foiled last week. All day long, these men have labored to put things right." After Logan, psychological warfare took effect, Sarah saw the town spring to life. A few locals rushed by the reconstituted riders. Anxiety's ties reignited. Still others paused to peruse the flyers, their expressions betraying the tension between the past and the present. An emergency meeting has been called by the town council. According to Sheriff Wilson, he has joined them. The rehabilitation program is being threatened by some. Proclaim that these flyers demonstrate the dangers of the situation. Something out of the ordinary occurred, though, before anybody could answer. The hardware store's Tom Wilson began pasting his own sheets beside Logan flyers. There were images from recently. The same people who were once tormented by the night riders are now helping to repair homes, earning honest jobs, and safeguarding the neighborhood. "Do you wish to delve into their history?" Tom yelled out to the spectators who had gathered. "We should also discuss their current situation. The complete tale needs to be shown." The concept went viral. Pictures of Spectre assisting elderly clients were shared by Betty. Reformed riders mentoring problematic youths was a common theme at the community center. Logan found a way for the village to redeem itself for every wrongdoing he disclosed. Observing the spontaneous response, Sarah noted that Logan wasn't expecting this. In his mind, he could sway the populace to oppose them. On the contrary, he is emphasizing once again the significance of this program. Approaching the gathering, Stryker's huge stature seemed to shrink as he bared his past. "I did the worst things to my flyers. I understand why people are terrified. After that, demonstrate to them why they are wrong," James said. "In the shadows, terror grows. Unveil your hidden history. Feel proud of it. Demonstrate to them your progress." At the warehouse, which had become a symbol of their metamorphosis, the former night riders congregated. Their courageous decisions, done one by one, were more audacious than any violent deed. Publicly confronting their past was their choice. Spectre was the first to speak at the spontaneous community meeting. "Those flyers couldn't be more accurate. Monsters, we were. However, there is more to the story. Here in this very room is the complete truth. A community deserving of protection, men who discovered their way back, and a municipality that offered us a second opportunity." Motorcyclists were congregating and observing at the outskirts of town, as Sarah had noted. They appeared uncertain as Logan's forces began to amass. Nothing had gone according to plan in the reaction to their psychological assault. Morrison broke the news that word had reached other communities. Our success here is too obvious to deny, but Logan attempted a similar strategy there, attempting to halt rival rehabilitation programs before they ever begin. Veteran after veteran showed up throughout the day, not to engage in combat but to bear testimony. The individuals recounted their individual experiences of overcoming adversity, demonstrating that the transformation from fighter to guardian wasn't exclusive to Eagles Hollow. Logan has no idea who or what he is actually fighting. As the town rallied around its reconstituted protectors, Betty watched on. He misunderstands, this has more to do with something other than the Shadow Riders. A story of optimism. With the arrival of nightfall, the community had amplified Logan's assault. The flyers were still up, but now there was proof of progress, growth, and redemption all around them. With an eye toward strategy, Sarah forewarned that he would attempt something different. We were unbreakable. His behavior will become more aggressive. Feeling the tension in the room, James gave a subtle nod. Very well. Permit him. Since each assault serves as proof of their metamorphosis rather than a mere test. Running away from your past isn't going to get you anywhere. In spite of everything, you can choose to be better if you face it, own it, and own up to it. As the sun dipped below Eagles Hollow's horizon, it illuminated the town's newspapers. Tragedies and triumphs, set in a community that had decided to trust in the transformative potential of hope. Logan had sought to harness the power of history for his own ends, but he discovered that on Eagles Hollow, even the most dreadful tales could be turned into a symbol of the potential for redemption. Logan Steele didn't unleash the full-on assault that everyone was expecting when he eventually exposed his hand. Instead, he went for the reformed Shadow Riders' newly minted honor, the very place where they were weakest. While Jimmy Chen was shutting the hardware store, 3 of his riders cornered him. He was Tom Wilson's youngest employee. At a time when many others were still afraid to approach the reformed riders, the 17-year-old son of Vietnamese refugees offered them companionship. Even though he had been assisting Betty in closing the diner, specters saw the altercation from steal the street. As a Shadow Rider, his natural inclination was to retaliate violently. On the contrary, he grabbed for his mobile. Despite the anxiety, Sarah, his voice remained steady. Things are not going well at Tom's. They're baiting us. Why? The child. Logan was going to hit the community's weak spots, so Sarah was already taking action. Retain hold. Keep them from getting what they desire. As night fell, they could make out Logan's men encircling Jimmy, their goals crystal plain. They had no intention of causing him harm. They wanted the reformed riders to decide between continuing along their new road or risking harm to innocent people. Spectre reported it to the sheriff. Fists formed on his palms of his hands. Unfortunately, they will be late arriving. Just give the kid a couple of minutes before things get out of hand. Through Spectre's earpiece, a steady and authoritative voice proclaimed James. Opting out of a conflict can be the hardest battle of all. Have faith in the teacher. Be confident in the strategy. Sarah climbed to her vantage point and, using her eyes honed for battle, assessed the situation. Just 3 of Logan's riders are visible, he likely has 2 more concealed for backup. Armed men they were. Equipment fit for a professional, not your average gangster. A meticulously orchestrated provocation, this was. One of Logan's guys yelled out to Spectre, saying, "It seems like you've lost your edge. We would have been deposed by now if you had the time." Perhaps the whispers are accurate. Town pets, indeed, are the powerful Shadow Riders. Jimmy shown incredible bravery for an adolescent by refusing to back down. You'd be surprised. They're not as bad as you're making them out to be. Sarah observed the expression on Spectre's face as he struggled within. Before, he would have charged in regardless of the consequences. The old him saw the trap, but he couldn't bear to see an innocent person hurt. The voice of Morrison, who had previously been trained, joined the radio station. The best course of action isn't always the one that stands out. Sarah could just make out silhouettes of people moving through the street as they positioned themselves, veterans taking up arms, and members of the community softly leading others to safety. An organized reaction that demonstrated Eagles Hollow's progress. It was the last opportunity, betrayers, Logan's leading guy declared. Either prove that the Shadow Riders are still around, or teach the child the consequences of putting their faith in ex-convicts. Without resorting to violence, Spectre advanced. Consistent and audible, his voice echoed Steele the street. On one point, you are correct. If I had the chance, I would have immediately put you down. Logan desires that. Just show that we're still a bunch of biker thugs. Following the lesson in situational awareness that Sarah had been teaching the kids of the town, Jimmy took advantage of the diversion to put some space between himself and his assailants. However, Logan fails to grasp this. Spectre kept moving forward, moving at a leisurely pace. Our lack of will to fight is not an indication of our weakness. We've grown up enough to know better, and that's why we're rejecting. A larger group of ex-Shadow Riders, their expressions less angry and more determined, stepped out of Betty's diner. After weeks of training with Morrison and the veterans, they now moved with military precision. Are they visible to you? Spectre extended a hand to the approaching throng. They aren't listening. This is a group of people. One that saw potential in us even if we were unworthy of the opportunity. An honor we have pledged to preserve in the proper manner. Sarah saw the men under Logan's command come to their senses far too late. They were planning to start a gang war. They were met instead by a group of civilians who were all working toward a common goal, including police officers, veterans of the war, and others. Sheriff Wilson's voice roared from behind them, telling them to drop their weapons. Or else, they would discover the consequences of threatening a town that has taught itself to stand together. The would-be assailants were confronted with the united determination of a changed community in addition to police enforcement. Their guns shattered on the concrete as they realized their situation was hopeless. "Tell Logan something for me," they whispered. As they were being handcuffed, Spectre spoke to the men who had been captured. "Warn him that the Shadow Riders he knew have indeed died. We discovered a more worthy cause to battle for. An authentic experience." With an expression that belied his years, Jimmy approached Spectre once the situation had calmed down. "Fight them if you wanted to. With the older one, you'd have." According to Spectre, the old me was a wimp. "I became powerful through mental aggression. I learned what true strength looks like after I lost everything." Sarah observed the aftermath and took note of the reformed riders' cooperative nature with the police. There was no evidence of bloodshed. Nobody had reneged on their promise to reform. Still, the triumph was more comprehensive than the outcome of any gang war. Morrison joined her and noticed that Logan wouldn't stop. He will be motivated to pursue greater endeavors as a result of this setback. "Let him come," Sarah said, perceiving the togetherness radiating from everyone around her. "The struggle of yesterday is still with him. The peace of tomorrow will be built by us." The Shadow Riders, now guarding Falcon's Hollow as the sun went down, were no longer gang members out for blood and mayhem, but rather community guardians who had discovered that the toughest battles are the ones we choose to walk away from, defeated or not. Quickly, word got around about Logan Steele's baiting attempt, which had failed miserably with the reformed riders. Rather than dissuading him, the setback appeared to inflame his fury. A terrible picture was drawn by the intelligence obtained by Morrison's veteran network. All the friends, allies, and sinister connections that Logan had formed throughout his time spent in the criminal underground were being summoned by Logan. "He has assembled his army at the old mill," Sarah reported from an emergency meeting at the warehouse, which was held 10 miles away. Nowadays, it's not only motorcyclists, mercenaries, professional muscle, and anyone else with a beef against Reformation initiatives are also welcome. Falcon's Hollow was seen getting ready via the warehouse windows. Together with veterans and townspeople, the reformed Shadow Riders fortified strategic sites, set up communication networks, and prepared for the inevitable. Spreading surveillance photos around the table, Sheriff Wilson noted that the latest count puts his numbers at over 100. He has grand plans for an invasion, not a gang brawl. After seeing the images, Spectres realized that his background as a scout was useful in a new context. Take a look at their gear: tactical vests, military-grade gear. This is being funded by someone. James, who is blind, spoke up about other gangs when he managed to locate Logan's picture among the many that were lying around. Because of what we've started here, they're terrified that their own members may begin to doubt and even remember their former selves. Coffee and sandwiches were brought over by Betty, whose diner had transformed into something of a nerve center. Initiating their own programs based on our approach, 5 more communities contacted us today. This is becoming a major problem. As the day progressed, Sarah noticed an influx of veterans, including motorcyclists and former troops of various ranks. Falcon's Hollow, the Metamorphosis, and the heroic fight for atonement rather than vengeance were all things that everyone had heard of. Morrison made the observation that Logan seems confused about his true enemy. He attributes it to the Night Rider's treachery. Something far greater is at stake. Blade came back from his patrol with the same composed demeanor he had when he was in the military. Fear grips towns, but they refuse to flee. People are checking on neighbors and business owners are boarding up windows. They're on our side. Now a stronghold of community defense, the warehouse had been a sign of gang domination in the past. Former adversaries coordinated their efforts with the precision of a military operation as maps covered the walls and communications equipment buzzed with activity. On his way back from reconnaissance, Spectre reported seeing activity on the periphery. Logan is assessing our perimeter by dispatching scouts. Something major is in the works, and it's likely to happen tonight. Sarah's strategic brain was already spotting trends and making plans for the worse. He'll do his best to divide us and make us pick between defending different sections of town. His voice betrayed the same quiet authority that had guided troops in battle, and that is what James meant when he replied. We have moved past our division. We aren't defending any one area here. The aim is to safeguard the house. As the day progressed, additional backers showed up. The narrative of a town's metamorphosis has captivated media outlets, federal agents keeping tabs on the situation, and even police units from nearby counties. Above all else, however, ordinary people stood up and refused to be scared away. Sheriff Wilson made the announcement after receiving information from a source within Logan camp. The point, he tells his men, is to set an example. Demonstrate to other communities the consequences of gang softening. Permit him to attempt. A different type of power was in Spectre's voice. He has the wrong impression of us. A better approach exists, and we're demonstrating it to them. Jimmy Chen's parents sent meals for the defenders when they arrived. Freely offering support to their former tormentors turned protectors, the Chinese eatery they'd formerly paid protection money to was transformed. Tonight, you fight not only for yourselves, but for every community that needs to think change is possible, my father says to tell you, Jimmy interpreted for his dad. The air at Eagle's Hollow was heavy with anticipation as night fell. The reformed Shadow Riders assumed their roles as protectors of the community that had extended a second opportunity to them, rather than as gang members vying for control of territory. As Sarah watched the sun set from the rooftop of the warehouse, she noted that Logan seemed to think he had the upper hand. Things like numbers, weapons, and surprise are great, but he's overlooking the most crucial component. Then what is it? While double-checking his radio gear for a final time, Spectre inquired. From below, James responded with a purpose. He's fiercely battling to bring down an object. We will not rest till we safeguard it. A tremendous impact is exerted by that. With a pause for breath, the shadows positioned themselves above Eagle's Hollow. The community had lost its fear of the approaching darkness, even though it could see out the headlights of Logan's amassing army. They had realized that unity and faith in the power of positive change were more important than aggression and fear. No matter what happens tonight, Morrison spoke to the gathered defense. Keep in mind that Eagles Hollow is no longer the only focus of this. The point is not merely that redemption is conceivable, it must be proven. Defending it is worthwhile. With their metamorphosis nearly complete, the restored Shadow Riders prepared for the biggest challenge yet. As much as Logan Steele wanted to ruin what they had accomplished, he was about to discover that it was considerably more difficult to break men who had regained their honor than it was to break men who had lost it. Logan Steele launched an overwhelming forceful attack on Eagles Hollow. Armed and prepared for bloodshed, the riders on more than 50 motorcycles sped into town from all directions. In the rear, hulking like beasts in the night, were vehicles stocked with hired muscle. From her vantage position near Betty's diner, Sarah reported that they're striking 3 points at once. The community center, Main Street, and the warehouse district are all attempting to put us to the test. Logan was personally leading the main force, as they could see him through the night vision technology that Morrison had supplied. His expression betrayed his icy resolve. He was willing to risk everything to make his point. Put your training to memory. The radio network carried James's voice. We have come not to engage in combat but rather to defend. Distinction exists. Their maneuvers now exhibited military efficiency rather than gang anarchy, thanks to Spectre's coordination from the warehouse command center. Collaborating with veterans and community volunteers, each man had been given a particular region to protect. According to Morrison, who was observing the attackers' formation, the first waves were mainly for show. He wants us to do something, anything, to show that we're still thugs with stronger support. The megaphone resounded through the buildings as Logan's voice boomed. This is your final opportunity, villains. Come back to our group immediately. If we can just admit that this whole rehabilitation hoax was a hoax, maybe we can save this community. Through her scope, Sarah observed the reaction of the altered Shadow Riders. No one budged from their protective stances. Nobody drew a weapon. They maintained a controlled and disciplined stance. Refrain from taking the offensive. According to Stryker's radio report, they are making progress on the community center. We will not back down, we have families in the subterranean refuge. Upon reaching the police barricade on Main Street, Logan's soldiers faced their first true test. They anticipated that the police would buckle under the pressure of overwhelming numbers and withdraw. Instead, they saw the same cops they'd battled against before now standing shoulder to shoulder with former Shadow Riders. Consider what you're truly destroying, Spectre said, his voice echoing through the impasse. A town and hope both. Optimism that things can get better and that salvation is within reach. Even in the dark of darkness, Logan's laughter resounded sharply. Hope. Here in this world, I will demonstrate the value of hope. With a single signal, he ordered his army to charge forward. Conversely, Eagles Hollow was prepared. At critical steel roads, fire trucks erupted in a barrage of high-pressure spray from their water cannons. Because of the disruption to their meticulous preparation caused by basic civic equipment that was put to defensive use, the attackers' formation disintegrated. Sarah wrote that the East Group is breaking up as they follow people's whereabouts. Feeling the heat from Logan's hired muscle. Not this, they were expecting a gang battle. In the midst of all the mayhem, Betty's diner shone like a lighthouse. The local watering well became a command post and aid station as the villagers within coordinated their assistance operations. We have injuries. Someone near the warehouse made the call. In an attempt to evade the water cannons, one of Logan's men had crashed. His former brother was now their assailant, but Spectre and 2 other reforming riders wasted no time in moving to his aid. Where have you been? As they helped the wounded guy to his feet, he questioned. Spectre told him, I'll show you the difference, as she guided him to the makeshift clinic that Betty had put up. Our current identity is this. As Logan observed his own troops being assisted by the same people he had come to punish, his enraged expression twisted into a scowl. Nothing was going as planned. Instead of resorting to violence, Falcon's Hollow was responding with an even more potent strategy. Sarah watched the assailants' actions and noticed that they were reorganizing. Logan becomes visibly distressed when the initial wave comes to a halt. James responded, because he doesn't know what he's fighting for, implying that the blind man's eyesight is more acute than average. Violence will never be able to thwart transformation. Men who have discovered their calling are unbreakable. Logan mustered his soldiers for yet another charge into the night, but this time something was different. The distinction between gang brutality and community defense made his hired muscle hesitate. As they disappeared into the night, some were already stealthily departing. Morrison ordered Logan to hold the line as he got ready to launch his second wave. Demonstrate to them the true essence of power. There has never been a time when the transformed Shadow Riders stood so tall and proud. Neither territory nor respect were driving factors in their conflict. They were fighting for a greater cause, the belief that atonement was real and that everyone could make a difference. Do you know Logan's deepest fear? As Sarah listened to the radio and observed his frantic getting ready, she asked. The fact that we will not resist will disprove all of his assumptions about our strength and power, not that we want to fight back. Even though the night had only just started and Logan Steele still had forces to commit, Eagle's Hollow had already achieved a significant victory. The power of a transformed community outshone that of a fear-based gang, as they had demonstrated. Over the defensive line, Spectre's voice echoed with confidence and steadiness. Never forget our current selves or the fact that we are fighting not for vengeance or territory but for the opportunity to demonstrate that change is feasible and worthy of defense. The second wave was on its way, but Eagle's Hollow was prepared, not to retaliate violently like its opponents, but to show the world that real power does not come from being afraid to change. As a result of their extreme desperation, Logan Steele's second wave of attackers were brutal. His surviving soldiers dispersed into smaller groups and attacked companies that had donated to the Rehabilitation Initiative. Along Main Street, windows smashed as his soldiers attempted to destroy the town's soul. Spectre broke the news over the radio network that Tom's hardware store is being attacked. Their plan is to set it on fire. With the eyes of a soldier, Sarah observed as Logan's plan took shape. In his attempt to disprove the town's hope in redemption, he wasn't content to simply destroy structures, he was going for the symbols of change as well. Under Morrison's direction, all forces remain in position. To have us give up our defenses and pursue his invaders is exactly what he wants. However, Eagle's Hollow was ready for this. With Molotov cocktails in hand, Logan's men stormed Tom's store, where they encountered not only the restored Shadow Riders but also the entire town. While veterans coordinated defensive positions, store owners and neighbors manned the fire hoses. As Sarah mentioned, they are following the movements of another group and will soon be striking Betty's. 3 armored vehicles standing guard. The radio clearly picked up Betty's voice. Invite them in, we have more than just coffee in store for them. An emblem of the town's metamorphosis, the diner brought together people who had once been foes over shared meals. Even though it was dark inside, Logan's soldiers were in no way helpless when they approached the building. Over the radio, James reminded everyone to keep in mind their training. It is their turn to initiate contact. We've shifted from attackers to protectors. When the assailants tried to force their way into Betty's home, they were met with a well-coordinated counterattack. The floor became dangerously wet as the fire sprinklers went out. Their night vision was ruined by the blazing emergency lights. With Betty by her side, Spectre and Blade offered an option rather than violence. Peer around you, the Spectre summoned the invaders. This is the target of your true assault. More than just a restaurant, it's a sanctuary where broken trust can be healed. When adversaries become allies. In this place, Sal. That ion takes place daily. Logan observed the failure of yet another aspect of his strategy via the windows. The ferocious pushback that his soldiers had anticipated was not happening. They were instead facing the force of change head-on. His wrath was palpable when he gave the command to fall back over the radio. Gather back at Point Charlie. As Sarah followed their withdrawal, she saw that a large portion of Logan's army was now vanishing into the darkness. The bodyguards he had hired were turning on him, refusing to stand up to what they were seeing. The warehouse is moving, according to Blade's account. Our rehabilitation center is under attack. Although it had been a symbol of gang control in the past, the warehouse was now a stronghold of community defense. Not only did Logan's surviving allies have to contend with the reformed horsemen, but they also had to face scores more veterans who had come to defend Eagles Hollow. A voice from Morrison echoed through the night, and it was clear that you had no idea what you were actually cutting down. This structure is more than that. It's evidence that things can change. That atonement is authentic. James listened to the reports coming in at the command center. Logan seemed to be panicking. His troops are beginning to understand that community safety is distinct from gang violence. More and more of Logan's soldiers deserted him as the night wore on. While some dismounted and rode away, others surrendered their weapons in an apparent attempt to gain a second chance, similar to what the old Shadow Riders had been granted. Logan, even your own men are deserting you. Seeing his increasing loneliness, Sarah yelled out to him. They're opting for change rather than disaster. As he rallied his surviving loyalists to the warehouse, Logan let out a yell of anger as his reaction. No longer was this a matter of vengeance or territory. It was all about dismantling the possibility of change itself. Through it all, Spectre's voice was constant. Keeping our current identities in mind here. Let us not forget what it is that we are safeguarding. Disputes are not the point here. Another technique is being demonstrated. The village came together in support of its new guardians. The locals supplied the defense positions with water and supplies. United in purpose, the former victims stood by the side of their former tormentors. Are you starting to get it now? As yet another contingent of Logan's soldiers capitulated, James radioed in an inquiry. How much you can destroy doesn't measure your true strength. It depends on what you decide to safeguard. The voice of Betty became part of the network. Have additional incoming. Keeping quiet. To aid. News of what's occurring here is making the rounds. Everyone wants a piece of it. The conflict over Eagles Hollow has escalated into something bigger for the Shadow. The ability to undergo change was demonstrated by it. A real-life example that salvation wasn't only a possibility. It quickly spread. Rehabilitative thinking was about to be shattered by Logan Steele. He was actually turning into its strongest point. He was demonstrating the world the critical need for initiatives like Eagles Hollows with each unsuccessful attack, defection, and gesture of communal solidarity. As Logan rallied his last forces for what would undoubtedly be his last desperate attempt, Sarah issued the command to hold the line. Demonstrate to them the appearance of genuine change. Demonstrate to them what needs safeguarding. The reimagined Shadow Riders assumed the posture of protectors rather than criminals and stood prepared. It wasn't land or honor they were vying for, but rather the opportunity to show that anyone could change given the chance and the motivation. With his vision of vengeance fading away, Logan Steele stood alone at the head of his diminishing force. 20 of his most devoted followers stayed behind, the others had either run away or caved in to the overwhelming impact of what they had seen at Eagles Hollow. He gathered his surviving guys and snarled into his radio, "This ends tonight. Whatever happens, the world will see what happens to betrayers who believe they can change." Being aware of the precarious stillness that precedes an explosive strike, Sarah monitored his every move from where she was standing. With all his surviving men, he is making one last drive for the storehouse. Looking out the windows of the command center, they could see out Logan's men stockpiling their last weapons. It would be more akin to a berserker charge, with the explicit goal of destroying the emblem of change, than a planned attack. Under Morrison's direction, all forces remain in position. We are not here to fight, but to defend, and this is what we have remembered. The radio broadcast Spectre's voice clearly and consistently. "Logan, have a peek around you if you can make out this sound. Check out how many of your own guys went against the grain this evening. You can still make the same decision at any moment." However, Logan defied logic. His men trailed after, their motorcycles rumbling through the darkness with their weapons drawn, as he led his last charge at them with a yell that resounded throughout Eagle's Hollow. Sarah then subtly gave the order. Unexpectedly, the town's reaction caught Logan off guard. From every structure along their way, lights flared as his forces rushed forward. No one came out to fight, but rather to observe, as doors flung wide. The whole community of Eagle's Hollow, including store owners, families, and elderly inhabitants, standing together. Children are carefully positioned behind their parents. Then what are they up to? A man battling for Logan yelled out, his voice quivering, revealing the true nature of the battle. James, who was standing at the entrance of the warehouse with his cane, could be heard speaking. A community that has faith in redemption, not merely a structure or a program. As his soldiers encountered not bloodshed but the unwavering scrutiny of a whole town, Logan's charge started to waver. They were joined by former victims of their terror who had transformed into reformed shadow riders who had made a different decision as witnesses. "Logan, it's over," Spectre cried out as she advanced unarmed. "Give your attention to the expressions on the faces of your members. The contrast between disrespect and reverence, between harm and safety, is clearly clear to them." The intensity of the situation made Logan's remaining followers desist from violence, and they did so one by one as they slowed their bikes. Instead of opponents to be vanquished, they were confronted with a symbol of their own potential. "No," Logan shouted as he pushed his motorbike ahead by himself. "I'll demonstrate the consequences for betrayers." He made a beeline toward the warehouse door, where Spectre and the other reunited riders were standing serenely with James. However, a remarkable event occurred before to his arrival at their location. Even his own men took action to halt him. After a while, his ex-lieutenant finally snapped at him and blocked his way. "Take a look at what they have constructed. Consider the alternatives." It was Logan's own supporters who had come to know the truth who encircled him, not his adversaries. Rather of destroying the transition, it had affected them. Sarah stepped down from her perch and declared, "You can't beat this with violence. When a notion is hope, it is especially important not to let fear destroy it." Tension hung in the night as Logan prepared for his test. Looking about at the society he had attempted to disrupt, his weapon quivered in his grasp. It wasn't only the town, the honor-bound shadow riders had also found their way back. His voice quivered, he lowered it, and he spat out what they did while assisting others. "It goes against who we are as a whole." "No," James said, his blind eyes having somehow located Logan. "Here we are, back to our true selves. Defenders, not destroyers. Guys who put the greater good ahead of their own interests." With the same comforting tone that had brought solace to so many troubled hearts in her cafe, Betty emerged from the crowd and spoke. "Logan, you are not alone, everyone deserves an opportunity to change." As if it were the final remnants of a dying storm, Logan's trembling hands let go of the weapon, which clattered to the ground. The rest of his followers piled off their motorcycles and peeled off their gang patches one by one as they surrounded him. Spectre remarked, not with victory but with quiet certainty, that the Shadow Riders are finished. However, a more substantial and superior alternative is supplanting them. Logan slouched on his bike while Sarah watched. He was visibly weak from seeing the transition he had fought so hard to stop. His destructive campaign had merely demonstrated the critical need for rehabilitation. What comes next? An ex-gang member of Logan's inquired, appearing bewildered in the absence of his gang affiliation. Morrison sprang to his feet, his voice exuding both dominance and understanding. "Belief in the prospect of change is a choice you can make now, just like these men in this town did." As the sun rose above Eagle's Hollow, it revealed a scene of rebirth rather than devastation. The triumph of the Shadow's cause was not achieved via bloodshed, but rather through the unwavering strength of change and the bravery of a people who would not surrender to the possibility of salvation. Breakfast is on the house at the diner, according to Betty's voice that echoed A. Steele the radio network. Now is the time to begin the healing process. At that very moment, as long-lost friends walked toward the prospect of coffee and camaraderie, Eagles Hollow demonstrated to the world something truly extraordinary, that helping your enemy find their way home may be just as satisfying as conquering them. Over Eagles Hollow, a bright and clear morning followed Logan's capitulation. As the excitement of the Shadow's event subsided, Betty's restaurant was filled to bursting point with old rivals reuniting over coffee and tables. As Logan sat alone at a corner booth, he started to grasp the ways his world had changed. While bringing a new pot of coffee to his table, Betty warned him that his was growing cold. Just months earlier, her palms quivered at the sight of gang members. Now, they were unsteady. Like she sat down next to James like she always did, Sarah noticed how the cafe reflected the changes happening in the community. The erstwhile lieutenants of Logan sat silently, observing as Spectre and Blade helped clear tables. Morrison informed them that the VA team is on their way to join them. What transpired here last night has been bruited around. They're referring to this strategy, which employs reformed gang members to avert rather than react to acts of violence, as the Eagles Hollow model. Crews were hard at work fixing the little damage that the Shadow's actions had caused, as they could see through the windows. Merchants collaborated with ex-Shadow riders and men who had surrendered to Logan. Reconstruction is an essential part of getting well. While he sipped his coffee, Sheriff Wilson mentioned that he had received calls from 3 additional communities earlier. They are in comparable predicaments. Curious about our process? The subtle insight that has steered countless metamorphoses was in James's voice. Mention that we are not responsible. They were men doing it. They were shown that it was achievable by us. Rather than making demands or threats, Spectre walked over to Logan's table while brandishing a yellow safety vest bearing the logo of Veterans Community Service. If you're ready to start, there's work to be done, he replied simply. With a tiny tremor in his palms, Logan reached for the vest and peered at it. Why? Why would you give me another chance after all I did here? After receiving an offer, Blade decided to join them. At a time when we were equally unworthy. That is the way it operates. You can't work your way up. It's all set. All day long. With a keen eye for strategy, Sarah watched as Logan's former followers watched him confront this decision-making moment. She saw small changes in body language. Betty informed the packed restaurant that the town council would be meeting in 1 hour. It is time for us to make a joint decision about our future. Although the council chamber was swiftly filled, the atmosphere was noticeably calmer than at earlier gatherings. On the contrary, the community came together in a shared sense of purpose after witnessing what had happened. We learned something crucial last night. First, Mayor Thompson. Concerning ourselves as well as the men who made the decision to change. Regarding the potential outcomes that arise when we decide to have faith in salvation. With a proud yet unbroken frame, Logan stood before the council. I have come to demolish everything that these men have constructed. On the contrary, I can see now why they went with it. Reasons for their arduous efforts to safeguard it. More motorbikes were visible as they peered out the room windows. Veterans and community leaders from neighboring communities are here to learn from Eagles Hollow's example, not gang members. Morrison suggested that the rehabilitation program be expanded. For all veterans who have served their country but are now lost, not only those who have been incarcerated. The bravery to adapt is more important than weaponry, as these soldiers have demonstrated. As Sarah observed the council meeting, the previous phone conversation that had set everything in motion flooded back to her. One decision that set in motion a chain reaction larger than anybody had foreseen. Volunteers have already begun to pour in, according to Spectre. Helping others, learning from our mistakes, and demonstrating what's possible are all goals of some of Logan's men. Whether they were friends or foes, Betty served them coffee and her renowned apple pie as she made her way through the room. Now her diner was more than simply a place to eat. Sharing a meal together may start the healing process, and it was a symbol of that. Sheriff Wilson discreetly relayed information received from the federal task group. A lot of other gangs are keeping tabs on what went down here. A few have inquired about possible rehabilitation programs. There has been a significant shift. When James paid attention to the people around him, he heard more than simply words, he heard the sound of real transformation. A win in the battle isn't always the pinnacle of success, he noted. The key is to demonstrate to other people that fighting is unnecessary. As the morning rose above Eagles Hollow, it shed light on a community that had been changed by more than just a single night's events, it had been changed by months of small decisions to hope in a better future. What comes next? Where am I supposed to fit in with this new reality? Logan inquired, his confusion evident. Listen, Sarah said, you have to follow these men's lead. You have the power to improve yourself every day when you rise to the challenge. Why? Because it's the right thing to do, not because it's easy. As the day progressed, more and more people stopped by, asking questions and providing chances to talk on the lessons Eagles Hollow had learned about salvation and change. As his departed brothers set out on their new adventure, Spectre waited at the windows of his chamber. The hardest aspect was that he didn't ask anyone in particular. Remaining unchanged. Proof that change is possible is being shown to others. Being a living example that an alternate path is possible. Following the conclusion of the council meeting, everyone retreated to Betty's, where they resumed their healing and connecting rituals over coffee and chat. The fighting had ended for the night, but the true triumph had only just begun. The constant decision to hope for change, to back atonement, and to construct something more resilient than terror or aggression could ever be. Just 30 days following Logan's capitulation, Eagles Hollow had transformed into a paradigm for neighborhood revitalization. Formerly a sign of gang domination, the warehouse now served as a daily orientation site for tourists from all across the nation. Leaders in the community, veteran groups, and police departments gathered to hear the story of a little town that had successfully transformed its enemies into its greatest allies. While at Betty's for the morning briefing, Spectre mentioned that Cedar Grove's program will begin next week. They have 28 veterans in their first class who were all formerly members of gangs. Our training model is being utilized by them. Logan guided a group of newbies through their morning routine, and Sarah watched from the windows of the cafe. He had previously attempted to derail their program, but now he was working non-stop to make it even bigger. He incorporated his personal growth into the narrative they exchanged. Morrison placed documents over the table and noted that they had gotten the final results from the VA research. Reducing gang violence through rehabilitating veterans has an 87% success rate. This is being referred to as unprecedented. As she went around the tables, Betty served coffee to both locals and tourists. Thanks to its role in demonstrating how shared meals might bring together ex-enemies, her diner had become famous for more than just its food. Sheriff Wilson noted that the state had provided the necessary funds. They planned to use formerly incarcerated riders as role models for other communities by establishing regional training centers. While listening to the reports, James sat quietly, his blind eyes perceiving more clearly than the average person. Because it is not about destroying history, the approach is effective. Making it into something significant is the key. As the morning progressed, additional motorbikes pulled up, this time it was officials from neighboring towns, curious about Falcon's Hollow's secret to success, rather than gang members. Unexpectedly, each guest discovered a community that had come to believe in forgiveness as much as a recovery program. The most difficult component, according to Stryker's explanation to the assembled police chiefs, is not beginning the program. As a result, the community sees that change is happening. Our daily deeds, not our words, speak volumes. At the warehouse, Sarah watched as a group of reformed men from Logan's program taught others how to shift from being an intimidator to a protector. The participants included some former night riders. The teachings extended beyond behavioral modification. They dealt with the topic of changing one's identity. Spectre reported receiving a call from Pine Valley once again. Their gang issue is intensifying. To put it simply, they want our model put into action. Morrison chose to dispatch a squad. Let them see the possibilities. To truly believe in metamorphosis, sometimes one must witness it firsthand. Betty came out of the kitchen with freshly baked pies, which were now legendary for bringing together people who had been foes. She declared, "You know what I think," before putting them down. That evildoers become virtuous isn't the true miracle. They're assisting other people in doing the same. As additional veterans showed up for training, the warehouse became a hive of activity. Beyond gang rehabilitation, the program has grown. Community outreach activities, counseling services, and job training were now part of it. Logan joined them after his morning session and reported that the latest initiatives were showing promise. Finding veterans who may be interested in joining gangs by utilizing reformed members. Avoidance rather than recovery. There was a fresh cadence to town life outside. Many local businesses hired X-Night riders to work side by side with regular people. Program alums taught de-escalation and law enforcement officers in their communities. Surrender was just the beginning of the metamorphosis. Its power increased daily. Did you notice the key to its success? During his visit, James spoke with the mayor. Reducing acts of violence is only part of the story. It's all about providing individuals with meaningful purpose. Soldiers require a purpose. We merely assist them in locating the ideal one. While Spectre and Blade guided another party of tourists about town, Sarah kept an eye on them. The success story and model for community healing that was Eagles Hollow was quickly making its way around. Wilson subtly brought up the fact that he had received word from the state police. Communities who adopted our methodology saw a 60% decrease in gang activities. It appears that making amends is infectious. More people came throughout the day, asking questions and sharing what they had learned about transformation. They gained a deeper comprehension of how communities could recover with each story. The hardest part isn't winning the battle, Sarah reminded a group of veterans who were launching their own programs. Creating a peaceful environment is the next step. Establishing harmony is our objective here. Changing lives one by one. The customary blend of residents and tourists gathered at Betty's dinner rush to share a meal and some anecdotes. The diner was becoming more than simply a place to eat. Community change was taught in a real-life setting. As he helped remove tables while wearing his yellow safety vest, Logan revealed an insight. "We came here assuming the battle was over territory, but these guys have greater ambitions. Their only hope is to persevere." More and more motorbikes pulled up as night fell. These were reformed riders from other places who had come to Falcon's Hollow to learn from the locals and share their stories. More and more individuals and communities were impacted as the waves of change began to ripple out. 3 ex-gang leaders are among the new applicants that Spectre will begin vetting tomorrow. They had heard rumors of Logan's transformation and were curious to witness it firsthand. Another day of change in Falcon's Hollow came to a close as the sun dipped below the horizon, but the effort persisted. A force greater than any amount of intimidation or bloodshed was created when long-lost rivals banded together at the warehouse, at Betty's Diner, and in stores all around town. No longer was the Falcon's Hollow model merely a software. It proved that salvation wasn't only conceivable, but life-altering. As a result of that change, people all across the nation were beginning to believe in a future where they might recover on their own. Sitting in their normal booth at Betty's, Sarah and James watched the early sun illuminate an altered Falcon's Hollow, 6 months after the night that changed everything. As usual, the diner was bustling with the customary mix of locals and tourists, including some long-lost friends reuniting over coffee and small talk. Observing an influx of vehicles at the warehouse, Sarah made the comment that the national conference is set to begin today. More than 200 people from various towns have gathered to hear about the Falcon's Hollow concept. The new program members were being briefed in the morning by Spectre and Logan, as they could see through the windows. Joining forces, the two men whose animosity toward one another has long since faded become an integral part of the town's history. Morrison announced that they had received the final figures for the first 6 months and were joined by fresh coffee. There has been a 70% decrease in gang-related violence in 15 towns that have fully implemented our approach. Rehabilitated more than 300 veterans. It wasn't simply to get more coffee when Betty came over to their table. The most recent national coverage of Falcon's Hollow's makeover was carried by her in the form of a framed newspaper story. Redeeming Small Towns Becomes National Model for Veterans Rehabilitation was the headline. Do you recall that first morning? Betty inquired, placing the picture on the table. As soon as the night riders rode in, they were filled with terror and thought they could break us. Seize this moment. As they worked outside to restore the community center, Stryker oversaw a group of program participants. As a result of their growth, the warehouse could no longer accommodate all of their projects. Sheriff Wilson brought additional good news when he announced that the VA had granted full funding. They intend to use our model to set up regional centers all around the nation. The program's training center will be located at Falcon's Hollow. James, who was blind in one eye, was able to hear and understand everything going on around them. Did you notice the true shift? Everyone here underwent a metamorphosis, not just the guys. We discovered the power of faith in salvation. Reformed motorcyclists from other towns began to show up, and Sarah noticed that they weren't gang members anymore. They were there to tell their own stories of redemption. The identical yellow safety vest, which had come to represent transformation, was worn by every one of them. Spectre joined the state task force during his break after receiving word from them. Additional 3 gangs have inquired about possible rehabilitation programs. What transpired here was witnessed by their veterans. Equal opportunity is what they seek. As people started to show up for the conference, the morning got busier. Officials from the police department, the town, and veteran groups are all learning the story of how a little town was able to transform its adversaries into its greatest allies. You know what the true attraction is for them? With Betty's assistance, Logan inquired about the increasing number of customers. Along with the program, they witness evidence that transformation is feasible. Redemption is more than a mere word. Everyone in Falcon's Hollow could view the goings-on of the town through the windows of the restaurant. Members of the community and nearby businesses were assisted by former shadow riders. Police officers received crisis intervention training from program veterans. Even after giving in, the metamorphosis continued. Its power increased daily. Sarah pondered as she watched the town she had played a part in transforming. Some thoughts regarding that phone call. There was a single event that altered the course of history for towns all over the nation, not alone Falcon's Hollow. Among the program participants, Betty served her renowned apple pie, which is now called Redemption Pie. She remarked that you didn't merely swap out the males. Our perception of them and ourselves has been transformed by you. As the conference-goers gathered around, James rose to his feet, ready to speak. The burden of knowledge gained through metamorphosis was in his voice. Not only did former rivals turn allies at Falcon's Hollow, but it was hardly the miracle. The important thing is that we discovered a deep truth about power. Power to destroy isn't where real strength lies. Being brave enough to defend, serve, and have faith in a better future is where it's at. More guests, more anecdotes, and more proof of lives changed arrived as the day progressed. However, Sarah witnessed yet another ordinary miracle at Betty's Café, the very place where it all started. Once bitter adversaries reunite over shared meals, jokes, and the everyday grind of overcoming their fears. Could you tell me what we actually created here? With a sense of pride, Spectre watched the scene and questioned. Something more than a software or a model. We created evidence that anybody can change given the opportunity and the motivation. Rising over Falcon's Hollow, the sun's rays touched a neighborhood that would never be the same. Something more formidable had supplanted the Shadow Riders. A community that has figured out how to see the warrior through the wounds, a bond of believers and defenders. The struggle for the spirit of Falcon's Hollow had ended. A new sort of conflict arose in its stead. Each day, they must decide whether to trust in salvation, whether to back change, and whether to resist the evil that formerly loomed over them. While indulging in Betty's Diner's boundless coffee and slices of redemption pie, the tale of that metamorphosis continued to be told, influencing countless lives and communities. It served as a powerful reminder that the true measure of success is not in vanquishing our adversaries, but in guiding them back to safety. 2 more amazing stories are about to load on your screen. If you loved this one, you should definitely check out the others. Go ahead and subscribe before you watch. I would be deeply touched.
Disclaimer. This channel stands against all forms of intolerance, discrimination, racism, and violations of human rights. The stories shared here are original creations, developed to encourage reflection, understanding, and constructive dialogue. All content is produced with a commitment to respecting diversity and honoring human dignity.